copper, and gin. That was the flavor of Thursday evening. The metallic tang sat heavy on the back of Nora's tongue, mixing with the sharp juniper fumes radiating from the glass Desmond had just shattered against the marble fireplace. Splinters of crystal caught the low light of the study, glittering like crushed ice against the soot-stained hearth. Nora didn't flinch when the glass broke. She simply blinked, keeping her eyes fixed on a single drop of liquor, bleeding into the intricate wool threads of the Persian rug. The rug was an antique. Her father had bought it in Istanbul. Desmond had spilled wine on it 3 times since they married. "Are you even listening to me?" Desmond's voice cracked, pitching upward in that specific, pathetic way it always did when he felt his authority slipping. He stood near the wet bar, chest heaving beneath a tailored white shirt that was already damp with sweat at the armpits. His tie hung loose, an expensive silk knot undone by nervous, trembling fingers. He smelled of expensive cologne, stale tobacco, and the sour, unmistakable reek of an insecure man cornered by his own failures. Across the room, draped over the velvet chaise lounge like a bored house cat, was Gemma. Gemma had kicked off her heels. Her bare feet, the toes painted a glossy, bruised plum, rested on the edge of the mahogany coffee table. She held a fresh drink, the ice clinking softly against the glass as she swirled it. She wasn't looking at Desmond. She was looking at Nora. Her eyes, heavily lined in black, were bright with a lazy, detached amusement. "I heard you, Desmond," Nora said. Her voice was flat, empty. She felt entirely hollowed out, as though someone had scraped her ribs clean with a spoon. "The bank denied the extension. The board is calling for a vote of no confidence. You want me to ask my father for another bridging loan." "I don't want you to ask him. I am telling you to inform him." Desmond took a step forward, his expensive leather Oxfords scuffing against the hardwood floor. "It's a temporary cash flow issue, a minor bottleneck. If your father hadn't choked the supply chain to begin with, I wouldn't be in this position. He owes me this. You owe me this." Nora finally looked up. She looked at his face, flushed and bloated with alcohol and rage. A vein throbbed near his temple. He was a handsome man once. The kind of handsome that photographed well for society pages. But up close, the rot was visible. The puffiness around the eyes. The perpetual sneer. "My father owes you nothing," Nora said quietly. It wasn't a provocation. It was simply a fact, stated with the exhaustion of someone explaining gravity to a toddler. "He bought you the company. He bought this house. The only thing you've manufactured in 3 years is debt." The silence that followed was suffocating. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded like hammer strikes. Gemma shifted on the chaise lounge. A tiny, breathy giggle escaped her lips. She quickly masked it by taking a sip of her drink, but the sound had already landed in the room. It was the spark hitting the gasoline. Desmond's face drained of color, then rushed back a mottled, violent red. His eyes darted to Gemma, registering her amusement, registering his own humiliation, and then snapped back to Nora. He hated Nora not because she was cruel, but because she was the living, breathing receipt of his inadequacy. "You arrogant, frigid bitch," he breathed. He moved faster than a man his size should be able to. He didn't reach for another glass. He reached for the riding crop resting on the console table by the door. A stiff, braided leather prop he kept around because he thought it made him look aristocratic when he went to the country club stables. Nora saw his hand close around the worn leather handle. Her stomach dropped, a cold, leaden weight plummeting through her pelvis. Her mouth went entirely dry. Adrenaline dumped into her bloodstream, loud and rushing in her ears, but her legs felt like they were made of wet sand. She didn't run. She knew the geography of this room. There was nowhere to go that wouldn't just prolong it. She turned her shoulder, instinctively tucking her chin toward her chest, bracing for the impact. The sound of the leather cutting through the air was a sharp, distinct hiss. It was a terrifyingly clean noise, devoid of the messy, fleshy thud of a fist. It struck Nora across the back of her shoulders, tearing through the thin silk of her blouse. The pain wasn't a dull ache. It was white-hot electricity. It flared across her skin, a searing, burning line that stole the oxygen straight from her lungs. She gasped, a ragged, involuntary sound, and her knees buckled. She hit the floor hard. The impact of her kneecaps against the hardwood sent a jarring shock up her spine. But it was entirely eclipsed by the fire burning across her back. She curled forward, her hands pressing flat against the Turkish rug. The wool fibers scratched against her palms. She stared at the intricate blue and gold patterns, her vision blurring at the edges. 1, 2, 3 blue threads. 4, 5 gold ones. She forced herself to count them. It was a survival tactic she had learned over the last 18 months. If you focused on the physical reality of the floor, the microscopic details of the dust motes and the carpet fibers, you didn't have to exist in the rest of the room. You could detach. You could become a ghost, haunting your own body. "Look at me," Desmond roared. He was standing over her now. She could smell the gin on his breath, mixed with the sour tang of his sweat. His shadow fell over her, cold and heavy. Nora didn't move. She kept her forehead bowed, her breathing shallow to keep the fabric of her torn shirt from rubbing against the raw, raised welt on her skin. She felt a profound, suffocating shame. Not because she was on the floor, but because she was letting it happen. Again. Because she was too tired to fight back. Because she knew, with a sickening certainty, that tomorrow she would call her father's secretary and ask for the money just to make Desmond stop. Then she heard it. From the velvet chaise lounge across the room, Gemma laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't a shocked gasp disguised as a chuckle. It was a full, bright, musical laugh. High and clear. The kind of laugh someone lets out when a comedian delivers a perfectly timed punchline. "Oh God," Gemma wheezed, the ice in her glass clattering as her shoulders shook. "Desmond, her face. Did you see her face? She looked like a kicked dog." That laugh cut deeper than the leather crop. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. A hot tear slipped free, cutting a path through the light layer of makeup on her cheek. It tasted salty as it reached the corner of her mouth. The sheer, banal cruelty of it all was paralyzing. Gemma didn't hate her. Gemma didn't even care enough to hate her. To Gemma, Nora was just a prop in the drama of her affair with Desmond. An obstacle that was currently providing excellent evening entertainment. The laugh acted like a stimulant on Desmond. It validated him. It erased the humiliation of his failing business and replaced it with a twisted, primitive dominance. He puffed his chest out. The trembling in his hands stopped. "She is a dog," Desmond sneered, aiming the words at Gemma, but keeping his eyes on the back of Nora's head. A spoiled, useless animal that bites the hand that feeds it. He raised the crop again. Nora heard the leather creak as his grip tightened. She braced herself, biting down hard on the inside of her cheek. She tasted copper again. She waited for the hiss of the air. She waited for the white-hot fire to strike her ribs. She squeezed her eyes tighter, focusing all her mental energy on the blue thread of the carpet. Wait for it. Just take it. Then it will be over. But the hiss never came. Instead, a different sound filled the room. A sound so completely out of place, so jarring in its normalcy, that it froze the air in the study. It was the heavy brass handle of the study's double mahogany doors turning. The click of the latch echoed like a gunshot. The heavy doors swung inward. They didn't slam open with dramatic flair. They pushed open slowly, silently, moving on perfectly oiled hinges. The draft from the main hallway swept into the stifling gin-soaked study. It carried the faint, crisp scent of the impending autumn night, mixed with the distinct aroma of cedar, expensive wool, and a faint trace of cigar smoke. Desmond froze. His arm was still raised, the leather crop suspended in the air. Nora, still on her knees, slowly turned her head. Her neck ached, the skin pulling painfully tight over her bruised shoulders. Standing in the doorway was her father. Richard did not look like a man who tore companies apart for a living. He did not look like the ruthless corporate titan the financial papers painted him as. He looked like an older gentleman who had just returned from a quiet dinner at his club. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat, unbuttoned, revealing a tailored, three-piece navy suit beneath. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He leaned slightly on a walking cane, topped with a smoothed piece of horn, not out of necessity, but as a quiet anchor. Behind him stood his driver, a massive, silent man named Thomas, who simply stepped to the side and closed the heavy mahogany doors behind Richard, sealing them in. The click of the doors locking shut was the loudest sound in the world. Richard didn't shout. He didn't drop his cane. He didn't rush forward. He stood perfectly still on the threshold, his pale blue eyes sweeping the room. He took in the shattered glass on the hearth. He took in Gemma, whose laughter had abruptly died in her throat, leaving her with her mouth slightly open in a frozen, stupid expression. He took in Desmond, sweating, panting, with the riding crop raised in the air. And then his eyes fell on Nora, on her knees, the torn silk of her blouse, the angry red welt rising on her skin. Nora saw a muscle feather in her father's jaw. It was the only micro-expression he allowed himself. The silence stretched. It became something physical. It pushed against the eardrums. It sucked the oxygen from the room. Desmond's chest stopped heaving. It seemed he had entirely forgotten how to breathe. The false bravado, the alcohol-fueled rage, drained out of him so quickly Nora could almost see it pooling on the floor around his shoes. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Desmond lowered his arm. The riding crop felt suddenly like a live wire in his hand. His fingers went numb. The crop slipped from his grip and clattered against the hardwood floor. The sound made Gemma flinch violently. "Richard," Desmond croaked. His voice was a thin, pathetic rasp. It sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "Richard, it's not..." He couldn't finish the sentence. There were no words that could construct a lie big enough to cover the reality of the room. Richard stepped forward. His leather shoes made a soft, rhythmic thud against the floorboards. Tap, thud, tap, thud. He walked past Desmond entirely, completely ignoring the man's existence. He walked over to where Nora was kneeling. He reached down. His hands, spotted with age but incredibly steady, grasped Nora by her upper arms, carefully avoiding the torn fabric of her back. With surprising strength, he hauled her to her feet. Nora swayed slightly, her legs numb. Richard pulled her against his chest, wrapping his heavy wool overcoat around her shoulders to hide her torn clothing. The smell of cedar and old money enveloped her. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of absolute, unyielding power. Nora buried her face in his lapel, her knees shaking so violently she thought she might collapse again. Richard held her with one arm. He slowly turned his head to look at Desmond. Desmond was trembling now, a visible, full-body tremor. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down the side of his face. He looked at Richard's eyes, and what he saw there made him take a clumsy step backward. There was no rage in Richard's eyes. Rage was hot, unpredictable, and easily exhausted. What sat in Richard's pale blue eyes was a cold, absolute void. It was the look of a man evaluating a diseased piece of livestock right before putting a bolt gun to its head. "Desmond," Richard said. His voice was a quiet, gravelly baritone. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. It commanded the air in the room. "Sir, please," Desmond stammered, putting his hands up defensively. "Nora and we were just having a disagreement. The stress of the business, the board meeting tomorrow, it got out of hand. I lost my temper. I swear to God, Richard, I've never—" "Thomas," Richard interrupted quietly, not taking his eyes off Desmond. From the shadows near the door, the massive driver stepped forward. "Yes, sir." "Take my daughter to the car," Richard said, his voice even. "Have the physician meet us at the penthouse. Tell him to bring a trauma kit." "Yes, sir." Thomas approached. He gently took Nora's arm from Richard. Nora didn't resist. She let Thomas guide her toward the doors, keeping the heavy wool coat clutched tightly around her chest. As she reached the threshold, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. Gemma was still frozen on the chaise lounge. The arrogant, bored mistress, who had been laughing 10 seconds ago, was now clutching her cocktail glass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She looked terrified, her eyes darting between Richard and the door. Realizing she was trapped in a room with a man who could erase her existence with a single phone call. Desmond was rooted to the spot, looking small, pale, and entirely broken. Richard slowly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He withdrew a silver cigar case and a heavy, matte black Zippo lighter. He took a cigar out, snipped the end with a cutter he produced from his vest, and placed it between his teeth. He struck the lighter. The flame cast harsh, flickering shadows across his face. He puffed until the end of the cigar glowed a dull, angry orange. He snapped the lighter shut and exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke into the space between him and his son-in-law. "The business," Richard said softly, picking up Desmond's earlier excuse as if it were a dirty rag. "You mentioned the stress of the business, Desmond." Desmond swallowed hard. He nodded quickly, desperately clinging to the lifeline. Yes, exactly. The supply chain issues, the bank. It's been crushing me, Richard. You know how much pressure I'm under?" Richard took another slow drag of his cigar. "I do, which is why I called the board an hour ago. I bought the remaining debt. The bank is satisfied." A wave of profound relief washed over Desmond's face. He let out a breathless, wet laugh. It was a pathetic sound. "Oh, thank God! Richard, thank you. I promise you, I'll turn it around. I'll make the margins work. I just needed breathing room. Thank you." Richard pulled the cigar from his mouth and studied the burning ash. "I bought the debt," Richard continued, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "And then I foreclosed on the collateral." The relief on Desmond's face shattered. "What? What do you mean? The collateral is everything. The inventory, the patents, the property. This house included," Richard confirmed smoothly. "As of 45 minutes ago, Desmond, you are bankrupt. You own nothing. You manage nothing. You are entirely, completely destitute." Desmond stumbled backward, his calves hitting the edge of the shattered glass on the hearth. He looked as though he had been physically struck. "You can't do that. You can't just take it all. That's my life's work." "Your life's work," Richard said, taking a slow step forward, "was financed by my patience, and you just spent the last drop of it on my daughter's back." Richard stopped moving. He stood over the riding crop lying on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He simply placed the tip of his walking cane on the leather handle and pressed down. "You have until the ash on this cigar falls," Richard whispered, "to walk out the front door. If you attempt to pack a bag, Thomas will break your legs. If you attempt to speak to my daughter again, I will not involve the police. I will simply ensure you disappear." Richard shifted his gaze slightly, looking at the cowering woman on the chaise lounge. "And take the trash with you," he added, his voice devoid of any inflection. Desmond looked at Richard. He looked at the heavy cane resting on the riding crop. He looked at the cold, unblinking eyes of the man who had just dismantled his entire life in under a minute. There was no argument to be made. There was no pleading. The reality of the room had shifted, violently and irreversibly. Desmond turned, his expensive Oxfords crunching over the broken crystal, and walked toward the door. Cold air hit Nora's face the second Thomas pushed open the heavy oak front doors of the estate. The sharp, autumnal chill was a physical slap, cutting through the haze of gin fumes and adrenaline that had saturated the study. It smelled of wet asphalt and rotting birch leaves, a stark, cleansing contrast to the suffocating scent of Desmond's fear. Thomas kept a wide, respectful distance as he guided her down the limestone steps, yet his massive frame managed to block the biting wind. Nora kept her hands clamped shut over the lapels of her father's charcoal overcoat, the coarse wool scratched against her chin. Beneath it, her silk blouse clung to her back, damp with cold sweat and a faint, sticky wetness she actively refused to think about. The Maybach sat idling in the circular driveway. Its headlights cut twin cones of blinding white through the rising evening mist. It looked less like a car and more like a private vault, an armored extension of Richard's will. Thomas opened the rear door. The hinges made absolutely no sound. Nora slid into the back seat. The supple cream-colored leather yielded to her weight, but she couldn't lean back. The moment her shoulder blades brushed the upholstery, a fresh wave of white-hot agony flared across her skin. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth, and pitched forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Richard slid in beside her seconds later. He brought the scent of stale cigar smoke and rain-dampened wool into the confined space. He didn't look at her. He simply tapped his walking cane twice against the partition glass. The engine's low, subsonic hum deepened and the heavy vehicle glided forward, leaving the gravel driveway without spinning a single tire. They drove in silence. Outside the tinted windows, the manicured lawns of Richard's estate gave way to the blur of streetlights and wrought iron gates. Yellow halos of halogen light washed rhythmically over the interior of the car, illuminating the sharp, aristocratic lines of Richard's profile before plunging him back into shadow. Nora stared at the floor mats. They were impossibly clean. The numbness was finally wearing off, making way for the terrifying, chaotic flood of reality. Her back throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Her knees ached from where they had hit the Turkish rug, but the physical pain was secondary to the crushing, humiliating weight of her own helplessness. She had not walked out of that house. She had been extracted. Like a stolen painting recovered by a ruthless collector, she had been reclaimed. There was no triumph in this escape. Desmond had reduced her to a cowering animal on the floor, and her father had casually stepped over her to dismantle him. She was the victim, yes, but in the brutal arithmetic of her father's world, she was also just the damaged property that had triggered the audit. "You're shivering," Richard said. His voice broke the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an expression of comfort. It was a simple observation of fact. "I'm fine," Nora lied. Her voice sounded thin, reedy, a stranger's voice. Richard turned his head. His pale blue eyes caught the passing light, cold and analytical. "You are in shock. Your core temperature is dropping. There is a cashmere blanket in the compartment beside your left knee. Use it." Nora didn't argue. She fumbled with the polished wood paneling, her fingers trembling so badly she scratched the varnish before she managed to pop the latch. She pulled out the heavy gray blanket and draped it awkwardly over her shoulders, over the coat. "Did you know?" Nora asked. The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. They tasted like bile. Richard looked back straight ahead. "Did I know what, exactly, Eleonora?" He only used her full name when he was preparing a trap. "About the money," she clarified, staring at the side of his face. "About the bank denying his extension. You said you bought the debt an hour ago. You knew he was going to fail." "I knew he was mathematically guaranteed to fail within the fiscal quarter," Richard corrected smoothly. "Desmond's margins have been bleeding out for 18 months. He over-leveraged the supply chain to fund an expansion he lacked the intellect to manage. The bank was a formality. He was a dead man walking since last April." Nora swallowed hard. The back of her throat felt like sandpaper. "And the girl, Gemma?" Richard's jaw tightened. Just a fraction, a microscopic shift of bone and muscle. "Private investigators are exceptionally thorough when the retainer is high enough. She is a cocktail waitress from a lounge in the financial district. An expensive, aggressively mundane cliché." A hollow, barking laugh tore its way out of Nora's chest. It scraped against her bruised ribs, making her wince. You knew he was bankrupting the company you bought him. You knew he was sleeping with a waitress on your dime, and you said nothing. You just watched." "I did not watch," Richard said, his tone dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "I allowed you the dignity of your own terrible choices. You demanded that marriage, Nora. You fought me in my own study 3 years ago, claiming I was suffocating you, claiming Desmond understood the modern market better than I did. I told you he was a hollow suit. You called me a dinosaur." He shifted, turning his torso fully toward her. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence pressed her against the opposite door. "I gave you the autonomy you begged for," Richard continued quietly. "I handed him the keys to a subsidiary and let him drive it off a cliff, purely so you could see the wreckage for yourself. Business failures can be written off. Foolish pride can be corrected through experience." He paused, and for the first time that evening, his eyes flickered down to the collar of the heavy overcoat, where the torn silk of her blouse was visible. The cold void in his gaze cracked, revealing something dark, ancient, and infinitely violent beneath. "But I did not know he would raise a hand to you," Richard whispered. "If I had calculated that variable, he would have been at the bottom of the bay before the ink dried on your marriage license. The financial ruin was a lesson. The physical assault was a breach of contract." Nora closed her eyes. The tears she had held back in the study finally spilled over, hot and silent, tracking through the chilled skin of her cheeks. She hated herself for crying. She hated him for being right. She hated the sterile, terrifying logic of his love. Morning arrived not with birdsong, but with the harsh, mechanical whine of an espresso grinder and the muted rush of city traffic 60 floors below. Nora woke in the guest suite of her father's penthouse. The mattress was absurdly firm. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, crisp and smelling faintly of lavender starch. She lay perfectly still for 3 long minutes, her brain booting up, cataloging the damage. Her back was a canvas of deep, throbbing aches. The sharp, electric sting of the crop had settled into a heavy, localized burning sensation across her shoulder blades. Dr. Hayes, a discreet man with a leather medical bag who had smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint and antiseptic, had arrived precisely 3 minutes after they entered the penthouse the night before. He had cleaned the broken skin, applied a thick, cooling burn salve, and taped a sterile dressing over the welt. "No stitches required, Mr. Sterling, though it will bruise spectacularly. Keep it dry. Ibuprofen for the swelling," the doctor had murmured in the foyer, thinking Nora was asleep. Nora slowly rolled onto her side. The muscles in her core protested, tight and bruised from where she had hit the floor. She pushed herself up to a sitting position, gripping the edge of the mattress. Her knuckles were white. She looked around the room. It was devoid of personality, neutral tones, expensive abstract art, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a skyline shrouded in morning fog. It was a hotel room for a ghost. On the bedside table sat a glass of water, 2 white pills, and a neatly folded pile of fresh clothes. Not her clothes. New clothes. A pair of loose dark gray silk trousers, and an oversized, incredibly soft cashmere sweater that buttoned up the front. Specifically chosen so she wouldn't have to pull anything over her head. The meticulous, suffocating care of Richard. She swallowed the pills dry. The water tasted metallic. She dressed slowly, her movement stiff and guarded, like an elderly woman. The cashmere was warm and impossibly light against her bandaged back. When she walked out into the main living area, the smell of roasted coffee beans was intoxicating. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of glass, steel, and dark walnut. Richard sat at the head of a massive dining table, an espresso cup in one hand and a physical copy of the Financial Times in the other. He wore a crisp white shirt, the cuffs rolled up twice, exposing forearms corded with the kind of lean, practical muscle men half his age paid trainers for. He looked entirely undisturbed. Thomas was standing by the kitchen island, wiping down the marble with a microfiber cloth. He looked up, gave Nora a fractional nod, and quietly vanished down the hallway. Nora walked to the table. She didn't sit. She stood opposite her father, resting her hands flat on the polished walnut surface. Richard didn't lower the paper. Dr. Hayes left a secondary ointment in the bathroom cabinet. You are to apply it every 6 hours. What happens to him? Nora asked. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual melodic cadence. Richard finally folded the newspaper, laying it flat on the table. He took a sip of his espresso. To Desmond, he ceases to be a concern. That's not an answer. It is the only answer that matters to you, Richard replied evenly. His credit lines are frozen. His assets have been seized under the foreclosure terms. His company car was towed from the estate at 2 a.m. He currently has whatever cash was in his wallet last night, and the clothes on his back. Nora stared at the dregs of coffee in an empty cup near her hand. She thought of Desmond standing in the study, his expensive tie undone, begging for breathing room. She thought of the sickening sound of the leather crop hitting the air. A strange dark knot began to tighten in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't pity. It was something far sharper. And Gemma? Nora asked, her eyes flicking up to meet his. Miss Hayes was politely escorted to a taxi, Richard said dismissively. She was informed that any attempt to contact the press, the police, or you would result in the immediate and catastrophic auditing of her family's rather creative tax history. She understood the parameters. He picked up the newspaper again, signaling the conversation was over. Eat something. Thomas has prepared eggs. Then you will rest. Nora didn't move toward the kitchen. She stayed rooted to the spot, her hands pressing harder into the table. The knot in her stomach was uncoiling, turning into a hot, bright wire of absolute fury. She was angry at Desmond, yes, but Desmond was a known quantity. A weak man who broke under pressure and lashed out at the nearest soft target. Her rage toward her father was entirely different. It was the rage of a chess piece, realizing the board had been rigged from the start. Richard hadn't just saved her. He had orchestrated the environment that required saving. He had let her walk into a burning building just to prove he owned the fire department. No, Nora said softly. Richard stopped reading. He didn't look up, but the stillness in his shoulders indicated he was listening. No rest, Nora said, her voice gaining strength, scraping against the walls of her throat. I want the ledger. Richard slowly lowered the paper. He looked at her over the rim of his reading glasses. Excuse me? You heard me? Nora snapped. The pain in her back flared as she straightened her posture, but she welcomed it. It kept her anchored. It kept her mean. Desmond's company, my company, you foreclosed on it. That means you own the debt, the assets, and the operational control. I own the wreckage, yes, Richard said, his tone cautious. Then I want the ledger, Nora demanded, walking around the table until she was standing just a few feet from his chair. I want the supplier contracts. I want the payroll sheets. I want the R&D files he was using to bleed the accounts dry. I want it all delivered to this table by noon. Richard took off his glasses. He set them down next to his espresso cup. Nora, you are injured. You are emotionally compromised. The company is defunct. I have a team of liquidators stepping in on Monday to strip it for parts and sell the patents to a competitor in Shenzhen. Cancel the liquidators, Nora said. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hands, resting on the back of a dining chair, were perfectly steady. I'm going to strip it. Silence stretched across the penthouse. The hum of the city below seemed to mute itself. Richard stared at his daughter. He looked at the pale, bruised skin under her eyes. He looked at the rigid, unnatural way she was holding her shoulders to protect her torn back. And he looked at her eyes. The soft, naive girl who had yelled at him 3 years ago about modern markets and trusting her husband was gone. That girl had died on a Turkish rug last night. The woman standing before him now had his eyes, cold, analytical, burning with a furious, hyper-focused intent. You have no experience in corporate liquidation, Richard stated. It was a test, a gentle prod against her armor. I have 3 years of experience watching a man burn capital to feed his ego, Nora countered, her voice dropping into a register that sounded terrifyingly like her father's. I know exactly where he hid the money. I know which suppliers he bribed. I know which board members looked the other way because he bought them golf memberships. I know where the rod is. She leaned forward, ignoring the white-hot flash of pain between her shoulder blades. He hit me because he had nothing left, Nora whispered, the cynicism dripping from every word. He hit me because it was the only power he had remaining. I'm going to take his life's work, Richard. I'm going to sit at this table, and I am going to personally sign the documents that sell his legacy for scrap metal. And when it's done, I am going to make sure the final receipt is mailed to whatever cheap motel he's sleeping in. Richard did not blink. He did not smile. He simply studied her face for a long, quiet moment. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it, tapped a single contact, and put the phone to his ear. Thomas, Richard said into the receiver, call the liquidators. Tell them to stand down. Then contact legal. I need the complete file on the Desmond acquisition, all physical and digital ledgers, brought to the penthouse immediately. He paused, his eyes locked on Nora. Yes, Richard finished. Set up a workspace in the dining room. My daughter will be handling the dissolution. He ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. He picked up his espresso cup, took a slow sip, and gestured toward the chair opposite him. The files will be here in an hour, Richard said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, yet laced with a dark, undeniable pride. I suggest you eat your eggs, Eleonora. We have a lot of blood to clean up. Cardboard boxes arrived at exactly 11:15. Thomas carried them in stacked 3 high, his broad chest pressing against the cheap brown corrugated paper. He set them down on the far end of the walnut dining table with a heavy, unceremonious thud. Dust motes danced in the shafts of gray morning light filtering through the penthouse windows. It smelled of decaying paper, damp basement storage, and the sharp chemical tang of laser printer ink. It smelled like a graveyard of bad decisions. Nora sat at the table. She had not eaten the eggs. They sat congealed on a porcelain plate near her elbow, the yolk a dull, unappetizing yellow. She pulled the first box toward her. The cardboard scraped against the polished wood, a harsh, grating sound that made the muscles in her neck tighten. She opened the lid. Files. Hundreds of them. Manila folders stuffed with the autopsy reports of a dying company. Richard sat in the living area, reading a leather-bound book. He had not offered to help. He had not offered a single piece of advice since the phone call. He was simply existing in the periphery, a silent, predatory anchor, watching his daughter unearth the rot. Nora pulled the first stack of ledgers. She opened the heavy green cover of the main accounts payable book. Numbers are not inherently emotional. They are stark, absolute, and devoid of malice. But as Nora dragged her index finger down the columns of Desmond's expenditures, the numbers began to take on a violent physical weight. $32,000. A consulting fee paid to a firm that, after a brief search on her laptop, turned out to be registered to a post office box in Delaware. $14,000. A client entertainment expense at a private golf club Desmond knew Nora despised. $8,000. A line item simply labeled miscellaneous logistics, dated 3 days before the bank first threatened to call in the loan. She turned the pages. The skin on her finger grew dry from the paper. Her eyes burned from staring at the tiny, precise fonts. Every few minutes, she had to shift her weight. Whenever she leaned forward too aggressively, the tape holding the sterile dressing to her back pulled at her skin, sending a sharp, localized spike of pain through her shoulder blades. It was a useful pain. It kept the exhaustion at bay. It kept the fury burning clean and hot. By 2 in the afternoon, the pristine dining table was a disaster zone. Stacks of paper formed uneven towers. Yellow sticky notes clung to ledgers like parasites. Nora found the personal accounts hidden within the corporate structure around 3 o'clock. It wasn't a sophisticated money laundering operation. Desmond was not a criminal mastermind. He was just an arrogant man who thought he would never be audited. He had used a vendor account, a supposed supplier of raw textiles, to funnel cash directly to a secondary checking account. Nora cross-referenced the dates of those transfers with his personal credit card statements, which had been neatly filed in a separate red folder. There it was, the timeline of his infidelity, itemized and taxed. A Tuesday in November, $450 at a boutique hotel downtown. A Thursday in December, $1,200 at a jeweler. A pair of diamond stud earrings. Nora had never received earrings for Christmas. She had received a blender. A Wednesday in February, $2,800 for a weekend rental in Aspen. He had told Nora he was attending a supply chain conference in Denver. Nora stared at the receipts. She felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She expected to cry again. She expected the betrayal to hit her like a physical blow, to knock the wind out of her. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a cold, dark amusement began to bubble up in the back of her throat. She had married him because she thought he was safe. She had grown up in the shadow of Richard, a man whose intellect and ruthlessness were terrifying. She had deliberately chosen Desmond because he was soft, because he was predictable, because he possessed a mediocre ambition she thought she could manage. She had wanted a golden retriever of a husband to counter the apex predator of her father. But weak men are not safe. When a strong man is cornered, he calculates. When a weak man is cornered, he panics. He lies. He strikes the nearest soft target because he lacks the courage to face his actual executioner. Find something interesting? Nora didn't startle. She turned her head slowly. Richard was standing by the kitchen island, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. The ice cracked sharply as the liquor hit it. "He bought her diamonds," Nora said. Her voice was flat, devoid of pitch. While he was defaulting on the health insurance premiums for his warehouse staff, he bought a cocktail waitress diamond earrings. Richard walked over. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at Nora. He placed the heavy tumbler on the table near her hand. It smelled of peat smoke and aged oak. "Incompetence is rarely solitary, Eleonora," Richard murmured. "A man who cannot manage a balance sheet can rarely manage his own impulses. They stem from the same deficit of character." Nora picked up the glass. The crystal was cold against her palm. She took a sip. The whiskey burned a fiery path down her throat, settling as a heavy, dark warmth in her stomach. "I have the final numbers," Nora said, setting the glass down. "The debt outpaces the liquid assets by 4 million. The patents are virtually worthless. The technology is 2 years out of date. He wasn't just failing. He was actively digging the grave. And your recommendation, as the acting liquidator?" Richard asked. His tone was formal. It was a boardroom tone. Nora looked at the sprawl of paper. She looked at the red folder containing the hotel receipts. She felt the dull throb in her back, the phantom hiss of the leather crop moving through the air. "We don't sell it," Nora said quietly. Richard raised an eyebrow, a micro-expression of genuine curiosity. "No?" "No," Nora repeated, her voice hardening. "If we sell it, it gets absorbed. The name changes. The employees get severance. It fades away quietly. I don't want it to fade quietly." She looked up, meeting her father's pale, icy eyes. "I want you to declare total bankruptcy." Chapter 7. I want the doors padlocked by federal marshals. I want the accounts frozen publicly. I want his name attached to the biggest, messiest corporate collapse this fiscal quarter. Let the industry press dissect these ledgers. Let his country club friends read about the fake textile vendors in the morning paper. Silence descended on the dining room. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed incredibly loud. Richard stared at his daughter. For the first time in Nora's 32 years of life, she saw the corners of his mouth twitch upward. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the terrifying, solemn smile of a man recognizing his own reflection. "Total dissolution," Richard said softly, tasting the words. "It will cost me more to bury it than to sell it." "You said the financial ruin was a lesson," Nora countered, leaning back in her chair. The tape pulled, the skin burned, and she didn't flinch. "I am simply grading the exam." Richard picked up his whiskey. He raised the glass a fraction of an inch in her direction. "Thomas," Richard called out without turning his head. The driver materialized from the hallway. "Yes, sir." "Call legal," Richard instructed, his eyes never leaving Nora's. "Tell them to draft the Chapter 7 filings, immediate cessation of all operations, and contact the business desk at the Times. Tell them we have an exclusive on a rather spectacular insolvency." "Right away, sir." Nora looked back down at the ledgers. She closed the heavy green cover. The sound was final, a coffin slamming shut. Rain began to fall on Thursday, a persistent, freezing drizzle that smeared the city skyline into a blur of gray and muted yellow. 3 days had passed. The welt on Nora's back had transitioned from a localized fire into a deep, agonizing ache. The skin had bloomed into a violent landscape of mottled purple, sickly yellow, and deep, necrotic black. Dr. Hayes had visited twice more, nodding approvingly at the healing process, oblivious to the fact that the uglier the bruise became, the clearer Nora's mind felt. The dining table was empty now. The boxes had been removed, replaced by a single, sleek, black leather folio. Inside the folio were the final dissolution documents. Desmond was gone. He had not attempted to call. He had not attempted to return to the estate. According to the brief sanitized report Thomas had provided over morning coffee, Desmond was currently residing in a cash-only motel near the interstate, wearing the same suit he had worn on Thursday night. The bank accounts were locked. His credit cards were declined. The federal marshals had chained the doors to the corporate office at 6 a.m. on Wednesday, with a photographer from the financial press conveniently stationed across the street. It was a surgical, absolute erasure of a man's life. Nora stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the rain. She wore a dark tailored blazer over a silk camisole. The structured jacket hid the slight stiffness in her posture. She held a cup of black coffee, the ceramic radiating heat into her palms. She felt different. The hollow, scraped-out feeling in her chest had not been filled with joy or triumph, or even peace. It had been filled with concrete. She felt heavy, grounded, and entirely unbreakable. She had traded her naive, desperate hope for a cold, cynical armor, and the fit was perfect. "The courier is waiting in the lobby," Thomas said quietly from the doorway. Nora turned. She walked over to the dining table and opened the black folio. Inside was a thick manila envelope. It contained the final notification of bankruptcy, the legal severing of all his corporate ties, and the formal divorce petition expedited by Richard's army of lawyers. It was the paperwork of a ghost. But Nora had added one more thing to the envelope. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't an angry note. It wasn't a plea for an apology. It was a single, crumpled piece of thermal receipt paper she had pulled from his personal files. A receipt for a $14 gin martini from the lobby bar of the hotel where he had taken Gemma. It was a small, petty, and utterly devastating detail. It was Nora telling him, without a single written word, "I saw the bottom of your soul, and it was remarkably cheap." She sealed the envelope. She pressed her thumb hard against the adhesive flap, tracing the edge until it was seamless. She handed the envelope to Thomas. "The motel by the interstate," Nora said, her voice steady and smooth. "Give it to the front desk. Don't knock on his door. Don't look at him. He doesn't exist anymore." Thomas took the envelope, his massive hand dwarfing the paper. "Understood, ma'am." He turned and walked out of the penthouse. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the silence inside. Nora walked back to the window. The rain was falling harder now, streaking down the thick glass, distorting the lights of the traffic below. She pressed her forehead against the cold pane. The chill seeped into her skin, soothing the lingering throb in her shoulders. She was Nora again, not Desmond's wife, not the cowering animal on the Turkish rug. She heard the soft clink of china behind her. Richard had entered the room, setting a fresh pot of coffee on the kitchen island. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a paternal speech about new beginnings or healing. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some wounds do not heal into scars. They calcify into weapons. Nora looked at her reflection in the glass, pale, sharp, and perfectly composed. She took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of roasted coffee and the faint, lingering trace of cigar smoke. It smelled like power, and she was never, ever letting it go. If you enjoyed this intense, grounded story of power, consequences, and shifting dynamics, please hit the like button. Don't forget to share this video with fellow drama lovers and subscribe to the channel for more raw, deeply human storytelling. Let me know your favorite part in the comments below and stay tuned for the next upload.